"Enjoy the streets, Mom." This was what the millionaire said to his mother before kicking her out of the house on her birthday, but days later, he was horrified to discover something. The sun rose lazily over the rooftops of the small town of Oakville, its golden rays caressing the facades of houses and waking their inhabitants to a new day. But in the majestic Thompson mansion, located atop a hill that dominated the landscape, the dawn light brought with it a special promise. It was the 75th birthday of Elizabeth Thompson, the matriarch of the family. Elizabeth woke up with a smile on her lips, her bright eyes shining with anticipation. Despite her age, she moved with a grace and vitality that belied the passing of the years. Her silver hair, carefully styled, framed a face that, though lined with the wrinkles of time, radiated an undeniable warmth and kindness. With care, Elizabeth chose her best dress, an elegant pastel blue ensemble that enhanced the color of her eyes. She applied a touch of makeup, something she rarely did, but today was a special day. As she looked in the mirror, she couldn't help but let her mind wander to the past, to the many birthdays she had celebrated in this very house, surrounded by the love of her family. "Today will be a wonderful day," she told herself, adjusting the pearl necklace that had been a gift from her late husband. Michael must have something special planned. Michael, her only son, was Elizabeth's pride and joy. At 45, he had become one of the most successful businessmen in the region. His company, Thompson Enterprises, was a giant in the construction sector. With projects extending across the country, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a mixture of pride and nostalgia every time she thought about her son. Pride for his achievements, nostalgia for the days when he was a little boy who ran through the halls of the mansion, filling the house with his laughter and mischief. With a light step, Elizabeth descended the stairs to the main dining room. The mansion was a maze of luxury, with its high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and period furniture. Every corner told a story. Every object was a memory of the years Elizabeth had spent there, first as a young wife and mother, and now as the grandmother living under her son's roof. Upon reaching the dining room, Elizabeth stopped short. The large oak table, which would normally be covered with a white linen tablecloth and the best china on special occasions, was bare and cold. There were no flowers, no cards, not the slightest indication that anyone remembered today was a special day. "Maybe they're preparing a surprise," Elizabeth thought, trying to keep hope alive. She headed to the kitchen, expecting to find the staff busy with birthday feast preparations, but the kitchen was silent and empty, with only the hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. Elizabeth's heart sank a little, but she refused to lose hope. "Maybe Michael wants to take me out for lunch," she told herself, heading to her son's study. The study door was ajar, and Elizabeth could hear voices before entering. It was Michael and his wife. Rachel. Elizabeth paused, her hand inches from the door when she heard her name. "I can't believe your mother expects us to cancel everything for her birthday." Rachel's voice was cold and cutting. "We have lunch with the investors, Michael. It's crucial for the new project." I know," Michael replied, his voice tired and distant. "But it's her 75th birthday. Maybe we could what?" Rachel interrupted. "Risk millions for a cake and some candles. Your mother isn't a child anymore, Michael. She should understand that the world doesn't revolve around her." Elizabeth felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Rachel's words were like daggers, cold and sharp. But what hurt the most was Michael's silence, his lack of defense. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth gently knocked on the door and entered. Michael and Rachel started like children caught in mischief. "Good morning," said Elizabeth, keeping a forced smile on her face. I was wondering if you had plans for today." Michael avoided her gaze, suddenly busying himself with some papers on his desk. It was Rachel who responded, her voice now sweet as honey but with a hidden edge that Elizabeth knew all too well. "Oh, Elizabeth, dear, good morning," said Rachel, approaching to give her a kiss on the cheek that never quite reached her. "I'm afraid we have a very busy day today, an important lunch with investors that we can't postpone." Elizabeth nodded slowly, her heart sinking further with each word. "I understand," she said softly. "I just thought, well, since it's my birthday." It was then that Michael finally looked up, his eyes meeting his mother's for the first time that morning. For a moment, Elizabeth thought she saw a flash of guilt, maybe even sadness, in her son's eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a mask of cold indifference. "Mom," Michael began, his voice controlled and distant. "You know how important this lunch is. We can't cancel it, I'm sure you understand." Elizabeth felt tears threatening to spill, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. "Of course," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to interfere with your business, son." Rachel, sensing the tension in the air, intervened with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe we can do something small tonight, right, Michael? A cake after dinner, perhaps?" But before Michael could respond, the phone on his desk rang. He answered it quickly, his face transforming into a mask of business concentration. "Yes, I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said before hanging up. He stood up abruptly, grabbing his briefcase. "I'm sorry, Mom, I have to go. Something urgent came up at the office." Elizabeth stood there, motionless, as she watched her son prepare to leave. Every movement, every gesture from Michael seemed to scream how unimportant she was in his life now. The boy who had once run into her arms for comfort could now barely look her in the eye. It was at that moment that something inside Elizabeth broke years of unconditional love, of silent sacrifices, of accepting crumbs of attention, all exploded in an instant of painful clarity. "Don't bother, Michael," said Elizabeth, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't need your pity or your last-minute cake." Michael stopped short, surprised by his mother's tone. Rachel, for her part, couldn't hide a smile of satisfaction. "Mom, don't be like that," Michael began. But Elizabeth interrupted him. "Don't be like what, Michael? A nuisance, an obstacle in your perfect life." The words now came out in an unstoppable torrent. "I've spent years trying not to interfere, not to be a burden. I've watched as you've slowly drifted away, how you've allowed money and success to change you, but no more." Michael seemed genuinely surprised by his mother's outburst. "Mom, you're overreacting. You know I love you, but I have responsibilities, a company to run. And what am I, Michael? An old piece of furniture you've inherited and don't know where to put?" Elizabeth straightened up, her small figure suddenly imposing in her wounded dignity. "Maybe it's time for me to go, to stop being a burden to you and your perfect wife." Rachel, who until that moment had observed the exchange with a mixture of annoyance and amusement, decided to intervene. "Elizabeth, dear, you're being melodramatic. No one has said you're a burden." But her words, far from calming the situation, only served to further ignite Elizabeth's indignation. "You," she said, turning to Rachel, "don't you dare call me dear. I've seen how you look at me, how you whisper behind my back. You think I don't notice, but I know everything." Rachel's mask of courtesy slipped for a moment, revealing an expression of pure contempt. "So what if I do? This is my house, my life. You're just a constant reminder of Michael's past, a past he's outgrown." Michael, caught between his wife and his mother, seemed unable to react. His eyes went from one to the other, as if he were watching a particularly violent tennis match. "Enough," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "Both of you, enough." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that Elizabeth recognized from his youth, when he felt particularly stressed. "Mom, you can't leave. This is your home too." But something in Michael's tone, a note of doubt perhaps, or maybe relief at the idea of her departure, was the last straw for Elizabeth. "No, Michael," she said, her voice now calm but laden with infinite sadness. "This stopped being my home a long time ago. I'll leave today." "Don't be ridiculous," Rachel snapped. "Where will you go? You have nothing outside of here." Rachel's words, though cruel, were true in a way. Elizabeth had dedicated her life to her family, to this home. Outside these walls, the world seemed like a vast and terrifying place, but at that moment, anywhere seemed preferable to staying where she was, clearly unwanted. "That's my problem," Elizabeth replied, heading towards the door. "I'll be gone before you return from your important lunch." It was then that Michael, perhaps feeling that the situation was slipping out of his hands, or maybe driven by a last vestige of the guilt he felt, made the mistake that would change everything. "Mom, wait!" he shouted, grabbing Elizabeth's arm with more force than necessary. "You can't leave like this. What will people say? What will happen to my reputation if it's known that my elderly mother is wandering the streets?" The silence that followed. These words was deafening. Elizabeth looked at her son's face, searching for some sign of the boy he once was, of the man she had hoped he would become. But all she saw was a stranger, a man consumed by ambition and selfishness. "Let go of me, Michael," said Elizabeth, her voice barely a whisper. But Michael, frustrated and angry, didn't let go. Instead, in a burst of cruelty that would later haunt him, he spat out the words that would definitively break the bond between mother and son. "Enjoy the streets, Mum. We don't want you here, not today, not ever again." The shock of those words was like a slap to Elizabeth. She staggered backwards, freeing herself from Michael's grip. Rachel, for her part, couldn't contain a triumphant smile. "Michael," Elizabeth began, but stopped. What else was there to say? Her son, the light of her life, the boy for whom she would have given everything, had just revealed his true feelings. Without another word, Elizabeth turned and left the study. She walked through the halls of the mansion, those halls that had witnessed so many happy moments and that now seemed to mock her with every step. She went up to her room, took a small suitcase, and began to pack mechanically, tears running silently down her cheeks. Meanwhile, in the study, Michael seemed to have awakened from a nightmare. "What have I done?" he murmured, looking at his hands as if he didn't recognize them. Rachel, however, showed no remorse whatsoever. "What was necessary?" she said, adjusting the pearl necklace she wore. It was about time that old woman was put in her place. Michael looked at her, horrified by the coldness of her words. For a moment he saw his wife as she really was, a beautiful but empty woman whose heart seemed to be made of ice. How had he allowed things to come to this point? But before he could say anything to try to fix the situation, Rachel interrupted him. "Come on, Michael. We'll be late for lunch. We can't keep the investors waiting." And so, as if in a trance, Michael allowed himself to be led out of the mansion by Rachel. The roar of their luxury car's engine broke the morning silence, taking with it the son who had chosen success over his mother's love. Elizabeth heard the sound of the car driving away from her room. With each object she placed in her suitcase, she felt that a part of her life, of her memories, was fading away. Photos of Michael as a child, love letters from her late husband, small treasures accumulated over the years. Everything now seemed to belong to another life, to another Elizabeth. When she finished packing, she sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was about to do. At 75, she was about to abandon the only life she had known. Fear threatened to paralyze her, but something stronger drove her on, her dignity. "I can't stay where I'm not wanted," she told herself, wiping away the last tears. With a deep sigh, she stood up, took her suitcase and left the room without looking back. The mansion, once a home full of life and love, now seemed like a cold, empty mausoleum. Elizabeth walked slowly towards the front door, each step resonating in the sepulchral silence. Before leaving, she stopped in front of the large mirror in the foyer. The woman who looked back at her seemed older and more tired than she remembered, but in her eyes shone a spark of determination. "Happy birthday, Elizabeth," she said to herself with a sad smile. Then, with a final sigh, she opened the door and stepped out into the outside world. The mid-morning sun greeted her with its warmth. Like a comforting embrace, Elizabeth found herself in the mansion's gardens, surrounded by the roses she herself had planted years ago. For a moment, she wondered if she was making a mistake, if she should go back and wait for Michael to reconsider. But the memory of her son's cruel words drowned out any doubt. With slow but determined steps, Elizabeth began to walk down the path that led to the street. Each step took her away from the life she had known and closer to an uncertain future. But with each step, she also felt that she was regaining something she had lost in recent years: her courage, her identity. Upon reaching the street, Elizabeth stopped, unsure of where to go. The small town of Oakville stretched out before her, familiar yet strange. Where could she go? Who would take her in? It was then that she remembered Sarah. Her lifelong friend Sarah lived in the center of town, in a modest house that had always been a refuge for Elizabeth in difficult times. With a destination in mind, Elizabeth began to walk, her suitcase rolling behind her as a constant reminder of her new reality. The walk to Sarah's house was long and exhausting. People she passed looked at her curiously. It wasn't common to see the mother of the most important businessman in town walking alone through the streets, dragging a suitcase. Some greeted her with respect, others whispered behind her back. Elizabeth kept her head high, ignoring the looks and whispers. After what seemed like an eternity, Elizabeth arrived at Sarah's door. With her heart beating strongly, she rang the doorbell. The seconds that followed felt like hours, until finally the door opened. Sarah, a woman of the same age as Elizabeth, but with a youthful spirit that the years had not managed to extinguish, opened the door with a smile that quickly transformed into concern upon seeing the state of her friend. "Elizabeth, what's wrong? What are you doing here with that suitcase?" Sarah asked, her voice full of worry. Elizabeth, seeing the familiar and caring face of her friend, felt that all the emotions she had been containing overflowed. Tears began to fall uncontrollably. "Oh, Sarah," Elizabeth sobbed, "something terrible has happened." Without saying another word, Sarah enveloped Elizabeth in a comforting hug and guided her into the house. The door closed behind them, shutting out the world that had been so cruel to Elizabeth on her special day inside Sarah's cozy living room. Elizabeth collapsed into an armchair, her body shaking with contained sobs. Sarah sat beside her, holding her hands and patiently waiting for her friend to calm down enough to speak. "Take a deep breath, dear," Sarah said softly. "You're safe here. Tell me what happened." Slowly, between tears and broken sighs, Elizabeth began to recount the events of the morning. She told her about the cold reception on her birthday, Rachel's cruel words, and finally, Michael's painful betrayal. Sarah listened in silence, her face reflecting a mixture of shock, sadness, and growing indignation. When Elizabeth finished her story, Sarah hugged her again, this time more tightly. "Oh, Elizabeth," Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I'm so sorry. I can't believe Michael would do something like that. That's not the boy you raised." Elizabeth nodded weakly. "I don't recognize my son anymore, Sarah. It's as if money and power have transformed him into someone completely different." Sarah stood up abruptly, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Well, don't worry anymore. You'll stay here with me for as long as necessary. I won't let you spend your birthday alone and sad." Elizabeth tried to protest, not wanting to be a burden, but Sarah silenced her with a look. "Not another word about that. You're my best friend, Elizabeth. Your place is here with me." For the first time since she had left the mansion, Elizabeth felt a spark of hope. Maybe, after all, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Sarah disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later with a tray. On it were 2 steaming cups of tea and a small cake with a lit candle. "It's not much," Sarah said with a shy smile, "but we can't let your birthday pass without at least a small celebration." Elizabeth looked at the cake, then at her friend, and felt her heart fill with gratitude. Tears returned to her eyes, but this time they were of emotion and thankfulness. "Sarah, I don't know what to say," Elizabeth murmured. "You don't have to say anything," Sarah replied. "Just blow out the candle and make a wish." Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened that day when she opened them. There was a new determination in them. She blew out the candle forcefully, as if with that act she was also blowing away all the problems and sorrows. "What did you wish for?" Sarah asked with a smile. Elizabeth looked at her friend and for the first time that day smiled genuinely. "I wished for the strength to start over," she said, "to show Michael and everyone that I still have a lot to offer." Sarah nodded approvingly. "And you will, dear, you will." As they shared the cake and tea, Elizabeth felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Yes, she had lost a lot that day, but she had also gained something invaluable: the freedom to be herself, without having to live under the shadow of others' expectations. What Elizabeth didn't know at that moment was that her birthday wish was about to trigger a series of events that would shake the foundations of the life she had left behind. Her search for a new beginning would soon intertwine with dark secrets, unexpected betrayals, and a twist of fate that no one could have foreseen. Meanwhile, at the luxurious restaurant where the business lunch was taking place, Michael found himself distracted. The investor's words blended into an indistinct buzz as his mind returned again and again to the scene at the mansion. The image of his mother, hurt and betrayed, haunted him. Rachel, noticing her husband's distraction, gave him a discreet elbow. "Focus, honey," she whispered with a forced smile. "We're about to close. The deal of the century." Michael nodded mechanically, forcing himself to pay attention to the conversation. But in the back of his mind, a small but insistent voice whispered that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. What no one at that table knew was that this seemingly routine lunch would be the catalyst for a series of events that would expose long-buried secrets and test family ties to the limit. As the sun began to descend on the horizon of Oakville, marking the end of a day that had begun with hope and ended in tragedy, the gears of fate were already in motion. Elizabeth, Michael, Rachel, and everyone else involved were about to embark on a journey that would change their lives forever. The stage was set, the actors in their positions, and the curtain about to rise on the first act of a drama that would keep everyone on the edge of their seats until the very end. The days following Elizabeth's dramatic departure from the Thompson mansion were a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries. While Elizabeth found comfort and a new purpose in Sarah's house, life at the Thompson mansion descended into silent chaos. Michael, tormented by guilt and confusion, immersed himself in his work with an almost manic fervor. He spent long hours at the office, avoiding returning to the mansion that now seemed cold and empty without his mother's presence. Rachel, for her part, seemed to flourish in Elizabeth's absence. She organized extravagant parties, redecorated entire rooms, and strutted around town as if she owned everything she saw. But beneath the surface of this apparent normality, cracks were beginning to appear one morning. About a week after the birthday incident, Sarah received an unexpected visit. Her brother, Mark, a former private detective with a reputation for being tenacious and meticulous, arrived without warning. "Mark!" exclaimed Sarah, surprised but happy to see her brother. "What brings you here?" Mark, a middle-aged man with penetrating eyes that seemed capable of seeing through any deception, smiled at his sister. "Do I need a reason to visit my favorite sister?" Sarah laughed, but her laughter faded when she saw the serious expression in her brother's eyes. "You've heard about Elizabeth, haven't you?" Mark nodded gravely. "News travels fast in a small town like this. How is she?" Before Sarah could answer, Elizabeth appeared in the kitchen doorway. Despite the difficult days, there was a renewed sparkle in her eyes, a spark of determination that wasn't there before. "I'm better than I expected, Mark," said Elizabeth with a tired but genuine smile. "Sarah has been an angel." Mark studied Elizabeth for a moment, his detective eyes capturing every detail. "I'm glad to hear that, Elizabeth, but I'm afraid I haven't come just for a social visit." Sarah and Elizabeth exchanged worried glances. "What's going on, Mark?" Sarah asked. Mark sat down at the kitchen table, inviting the two women to join him. Once they were all seated, Mark spoke in a low and urgent voice. "I've been observing Rachel," he began. Faced with the surprised looks from Elizabeth and Sarah, he continued, "Don't misunderstand me, I wasn't spying, but my old detective instincts woke up when I heard what had happened. Something doesn't add up in this whole situation." Elizabeth leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Mark took out a small notebook from his pocket and opened it. "In the last few days, Rachel has been making frequent visits to an office in the center of town. It's not the Thompson Enterprises office, but a smaller, more discreet building." Sarah frowned. "That doesn't prove anything, Mark. It could be anything." "You're right," Mark nodded. "But what caught my attention was who else visits that office." He paused dramatically before continuing. "Jason Carter." Elizabeth gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth. "Jason, Michael's best friend?" Mark nodded gravely. "The very same." And from what I've been able to observe, his visits suspiciously coincide with Rachel's. A heavy silence fell over the kitchen as the implications of this information settled in. Elizabeth stood up abruptly, walking towards the window. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts. "It can't be," she murmured. "Michael trusts Jason blindly. They've been friends since college." Sarah approached her friend, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Elizabeth, let's not jump to conclusions. There could be an innocent explanation for all of this." Mark stood up too, his expression serious. "Sarah is right, we don't have concrete evidence of anything illegal or immoral. But my instinct tells me there's something more here, something we're not seeing." Elizabeth turned to them, her eyes shining with a mixture of pain and determination. "We need to know more. If Rachel is plotting something, if she's cheating on Michael, I need to know." Mark nodded, a spark of excitement in his eyes. The old detective in him was awakening, eager to unravel this mystery. "I can continue investigating, but I'll need help. This could be bigger than we think." Sarah looked at her brother with concern. "Mark, are you sure you want to get involved in this? You're not a detective anymore, and if Rachel discovers you're investigating her—" "Don't worry about me, little sister," Mark smiled. "I know how to handle these situations. Besides, I owe Elizabeth a lot. It's the least I can do." Elizabeth looked at the siblings with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you for all of this. You're the only family I have left now." Sarah hugged her friend. "And we'll always be here for you, Elizabeth, no matter what happens." Meanwhile, in the offices of Thompson Enterprises, Michael was immersed in a mountain of papers, financial reports, contracts, proposals. Everything blended into a blur of numbers and letters. But no matter how hard he tried to concentrate, his mind kept going back to that fateful day of his mother's birthday. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, grateful for the distraction. Jason Carter entered the office, his usual confident smile on his face. "Michael, my friend, still buried in work?" Michael rubbed his tired eyes. "There's a lot to do, Jason. This new project is crucial for the company." Jason sat down in front of Michael's desk, studying his friend with sharp eyes. "You look terrible, Michael. Trouble in paradise." For a moment, Michael considered telling Jason everything about the fight with his mother, about the guilt that was eating away at him, about the doubts that were beginning to arise about his marriage to Rachel. But something stopped him. A voice in the back of his mind told him to keep his problems to himself, at least for now. "Nothing I can't handle," Michael replied with a forced smile. "What brings you here, Jason?" Jason leaned back in his chair, his relaxed posture contrasting with Michael's obvious tension. "I was just passing by to see how everything was going. I've heard rumors. Michael, people talk." Michael tensed. "What kind of rumors?" "Oh, you know how this town is gossip mostly." Jason made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "They say your mother left the mansion, that there was some kind of fight." Michael felt the color drain from his face. How had the news spread so quickly? "It's complicated," he murmured. Jason leaned forward, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Listen, Michael. We've been friends for years. You know you can trust me. If there's anything I can help with..." For a moment, Michael considered opening up to his friend. But something in Jason's look, a spark of something he couldn't identify, made him hesitate. "I appreciate your concern, Jason, but as I said, I can handle it." Jason nodded, leaning back again. Of course. Just remember, I'm here if you need me." He stood up, smoothing his impeccable suit. "Oh, by the way, have you checked the financial reports from the last quarter? There are some discrepancies you might want to look at." Michael frowned. "Discrepancies? What kind?" Jason smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing serious, I'm sure. Probably just an accounting error. I'll send them to your email." With that, Jason left the office, leaving Michael with a feeling of unease that he couldn't explain. Something about his friend's visit had disturbed him, but he couldn't put his finger on exactly what sighing. Michael returned to his papers, but his mind was far from the numbers in front of him. What was really going on in his life? In his company? In his marriage? For the first time in a long time, Michael found himself wishing he could talk to his mother, ask for her advice as he did when he was a child. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Rachel entered a discreet building. She looked around cautiously before slipping through a side door. Inside, in a small office without windows, a man was waiting for her. "You're late," the man said, his voice cold and sharp. Rachel took off her sunglasses, revealing an annoyed look. "I had to make sure no one was following me. Things are getting complicated, Victor." The man Victor stood up from his desk. He was tall and thin, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb light. "What do you mean things are getting complicated?" Rachel collapsed into a chair, her facade of perfect high society wife crumbling. "The old woman is gone, there was a fight, and now she's living with a friend downtown." Victor cursed under his breath. "This could ruin our entire plan. Does Michael suspect anything?" Rachel shook her head. "He's too naive. He's more worried about his precious company than what's happening under his own roof." Victor began to pace the small office. "We need to speed things up. The original plan was to wait, but with Michael's mother out of the mansion, we have a window of opportunity." Rachel looked at him with a mixture of admiration and fear. "What do you suggest?" Victor stopped, a cold smile spreading across his face. "It's time to move to phase 2. Get ready. Dear, things are about to get very interesting in the Thompsons' lives." As Rachel and Victor plotted in the shadows, and Michael struggled with his own doubts and guilt, Elizabeth, Sarah, and Mark began their own investigation, unaware that they were about to unravel a conspiracy that would shake the foundations of Oakville. The following days were a whirlwind of frantic activity for Elizabeth, Sarah, and Mark. Each played their part in the intricate dance of investigation, moving cautiously so as not to alert Rachel or Jason of their suspicions. Mark, reliving his days as a detective, spent long hours following the money trail, untangling the complex web of financial transactions that seemed to lead to an offshore account. Sarah, using her position as a respected local school teacher, listened carefully to the gossip and rumors circulating around town. Elizabeth, for her part, struggled with her own conflicting feelings, torn between the pain of her son's betrayal and the determination to uncover the truth. One afternoon, as Elizabeth was helping Sarah prepare dinner, Mark burst into the house, his face a mixture of excitement and concern. "I've got something," he said without preamble, dropping a manila envelope on the kitchen table. Sarah and Elizabeth approached, curious and apprehensive. "What have you found?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. Mark opened the envelope, spreading several photographs and documents on the table. "I've been following the money trail," he explained, "and there's something very strange happening at Thompson Enterprises." The women leaned over the table, studying the documents. They were copies of financial reports, bank transfers, and what appeared to be coded emails. "I don't understand," said Sarah, frowning. "What does all this mean?" Mark pointed to a series of numbers on one of the documents. "These are the reported revenues from one of the company's largest projects, and these," he pointed to another document, "are the real numbers." Elizabeth gasped. "There's a difference of millions." Mark nodded gravely. "Exactly. Someone is diverting funds from the company. And from what I've been able to find out, this has been happening for months, maybe years." Elizabeth collapsed into a chair, her mind spinning. "But who? Michael?" Mark shook his head. "I don't think Michael is involved, at least not consciously. My sources tell me he's completely absorbed in the company's new project. He barely pays attention to the financial details." Sarah, who had been studying the photographs, held one up. In it, Rachel could be seen leaving the discreet building Mark had mentioned before. "And Rachel? Do you think she's behind this?" Mark ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. "It's a possibility, but I don't think she's acting alone. She would need help from inside the company to move such large amounts of money without raising suspicions." Elizabeth felt her heart sink. "Jason," she murmured, "it has to be him. He's the only one Michael trusts enough to give access to that level of financial information." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen as the implications of this discovery settled in. If it was true, not only was Michael's fortune in danger, but also his freedom. If fraud of this magnitude was discovered, he could face criminal charges even if he wasn't directly involved. "We have to tell him," Elizabeth finally said, her voice firm despite the trembling in her hands. "We have to warn Michael." Sarah looked at her with concern. "Elizabeth, are you sure? After how he treated you?" Elizabeth stood up, a new determination shining in her eyes. "He's my son, Sarah. No matter what's happened between us, I can't stand by and watch his life fall apart." Mark nodded approvingly. "I agree. But we have to be careful. If Rachel and Jason are really behind this, they're dangerous. We don't know how far they're willing to go to protect their secrets." "So what do we do?" asked Sarah. Mark collected the documents, his detective mind already plotting a plan. "We need more evidence, something concrete they can't deny, and we need to find a way to approach Michael without alerting Rachel or Jason." Elizabeth walked to the window, looking in the direction where she knew the Thompson mansion was. Her heart filled with a mixture of maternal love and fierce determination. "Whatever it takes," she said softly. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect my son." As the sun set over Oakville, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, the three conspirators in Sarah's kitchen didn't know that their actions were about to trigger a series of events that would shake the town to its foundations. The truth was about to come to light, and no one was prepared for the consequences it would bring. At the Thompson mansion, oblivious to the approaching storm, Rachel was preparing for another night of social events and fake smiles. As she applied lipstick in front of the mirror, her phone vibrated with a message: "All set for phase 2. Wait for my signal. V." A cold smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. "Soon," she murmured to herself, "very soon." And so, with secrets bubbling beneath the surface and loyalties about to be tested, the stage was set for the next act of this drama. The truth, as always, would find its way to the light, but the cost might be greater than anyone imagined. The following days were a frenzy of frantic activity for Elizabeth, Sarah, and Mark. Each played their role in the intricate dance of investigation, moving cautiously so as not to alert Rachel or Jason to their suspicions. Mark, reliving his days as a detective, spent long hours following the money trail, unraveling the complex web of financial transactions that seemed to lead to an offshore account. Sarah, for her part, used her network of contacts in the community to gather gossip and rumors, seeking any information that could shed light on the suspicious activities at Thompson Enterprises. Elizabeth, meanwhile, struggled with her own emotions. The pain of Michael's betrayal was still fresh, but it mixed with a maternal concern she couldn't ignore. Every night she sat by the window looking in the direction of the Thompson mansion, wondering what her son was doing, if he was okay, if he even suspected the danger he was in. One afternoon, as they were reviewing the latest information gathered, Mark let out an exclamation of surprise. "I've got it," he said, waving a paper in the air. "I knew there was something odd about those transfers." Elizabeth and Sarah quickly approached, curious and anxious. "What have you found?" Elizabeth asked, her voice tense with anticipation. Mark spread the paper on the table. It was a financial report filled with numbers and codes that seemed incomprehensible to the two women. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of transactions. "These transfers, which are supposedly payments to suppliers, are actually being diverted to an account in the Cayman Islands." Sarah frowned. "And what exactly does that mean?" "It means," Mark explained, his voice grave, "that someone is stealing millions from Michael's company, and they're doing it in a very sophisticated way." Elizabeth sank into a chair, her face pale. "My God," she murmured. How much have they stolen?" Mark shook his head. "It's hard to say exactly, but from what I can see, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars over the past 2 years." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications of this discovery settled in. Elizabeth was the first to break it. "We have to tell Michael," she said, her voice firm despite the trembling in her hands. "No matter what's happened between us, I can't stand by while they destroy everything he's worked for." Sarah put a comforting hand on her friend's shoulder. "Elizabeth, are you sure? After how he treated you?" Elizabeth stood up, a new determination shining in her eyes. "He's my son, Sarah. No matter what he's done, he's still my son, and he needs to know the truth." Mark nodded, gathering the papers. I agree. But we have to be cautious. If Rachel and Jason are really behind this, they're dangerous. We don't know how far they're willing to go to protect their secrets. So what do we do? Asked Sarah. We need to find a way to talk to Michael in private, said Mark. Without Rachel or Jason finding out. Elizabeth was thoughtful for a moment. I know Michael. Every Sunday morning he goes running in the Central Park. It's a routine he's maintained for years. We could intercept him there. Mark smiled. Perfect, that gives us 2 days to prepare and gather all the evidence. Meanwhile, at the Thompson mansion, Michael was in his study, reviewing a mountain of documents. The words and numbers blended before his tired eyes. Something didn't add up in the financial reports, but he couldn't identify exactly what it was. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he said, rubbing his eyes. Rachel entered, looking impeccable as always in an elegant cocktail dress. Honey, still working? It's almost midnight. Michael looked at the clock, surprised he hadn't realized how much time had passed. I'm sorry, love. These reports, there's something that doesn't add up. Rachel approached, placing her hands on Michael's shoulders and beginning to massage them gently. You're working too hard, my love. You need to rest. Michael leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. You're right, it's just that since Mom left, I feel like everything is out of control. Rachel tensed slightly at the mention of Elizabeth, but Michael didn't notice. Your mother made her decision, honey. You can't keep blaming yourself for that. Michael opened his eyes, looking at his wife. Do you think I did the right thing? Letting her go like that? For a moment, something resembling guilt crossed Rachel's face, but it disappeared so quickly that Michael thought he had imagined it. You did what you had to do, she said softly. Now, come to bed. You'll see things more clearly tomorrow. Michael nodded, slowly getting up. As he followed Rachel out of the study, he couldn't help but cast one last glance at the documents scattered across his desk. The feeling that something important was escaping him persisted, but he was too tired to keep investigating that night. What Michael didn't know was that while he slept, Rachel silently slipped out of bed with stealthy steps. She returned to the study and began rummaging through the papers Michael had been reviewing. Her eyes narrowed as she found what she was looking for. Taking out her phone, she quickly took photos of certain documents before placing them back exactly as she had found them. Then, with the same caution, she returned to the bedroom and slipped into bed next to her sleeping husband. While Michael slept deeply, oblivious to the machinations happening around him, Rachel sent a cryptic message. The bird is starting to sing. Accelerate the plan. R. In another part of town, in a luxurious but discreet apartment, Jason Carter received the message. A cold smile spread across his lips as he replied, Understood. The cage is ready. Tomorrow we move to the final phase. J. Sunday morning arrived with crystal clarity, the sky a perfect blue that seemed to mock the emotional storm that was about to be unleashed. Elizabeth woke up before dawn, her heart beating with a mixture of anxiety and determination. Are you sure you want to do this? Sarah asked, as she helped Elizabeth prepare. Elizabeth nodded, her face reflecting an unshakable resolution. I have to do it for Michael. Mark arrived shortly after, carrying a briefcase full of documents and evidence. Are you ready? He asked, his voice tense with the anticipation of the confrontation ahead. The three headed to the Central Park in silence, each lost in their own thoughts and fears. Upon arrival, they positioned themselves strategically near the path Michael usually took on his morning runs. They didn't have to wait long, just as the sun began. To peek over the horizon, Michael's athletic figure appeared in the distance, his pace firm and steady as he ran along the path. Elizabeth felt her heart race at the sight of her son. Despite everything that had happened, the maternal love she felt for him hadn't diminished one bit. There he comes, she whispered. Mark nodded. Remember the plan. We have to be direct but cautious. We don't know who else might be listening. When Michael approached, Elizabeth stepped out from her hiding place, placing herself directly in his path. Michael stopped short, his eyes widening with surprise and a mixture of emotions at seeing his mother. "Mom," he said, his voice a blend of confusion and something that sounded suspiciously like longing. "What are you doing here?" Elizabeth took a step forward, her heart beating hard. "Michael, my son, we need to talk. It's important." Michael looked around, noticing Sarah and Mark for the first time. His expression hardened. "If this is some kind of intervention—" "It's nothing like that," Mark interrupted, stepping forward with the briefcase in hand. "Mr. Thompson, we have information that we believe you need to see. It's about your company and your wife." Michael frowned, his posture becoming defensive. "What are you talking about? What does Rachel have to do with my company?" Elizabeth took her son's hands, her eyes pleading. "Michael, please, I know things between us haven't been good, but you have to listen to us. You're in danger." Something in his mother's voice, an urgency he hadn't heard in years, made Michael pause. He looked into Elizabeth's eyes, searching for the truth in them. "All right," he finally said, his voice tired. "Talk, but this better be good." Mark opened the briefcase, pulling out a folder full of documents. "Mr. Thompson, we've discovered evidence of massive fraud in your company. Millions of dollars are being diverted to offshore accounts." Michael took the documents with trembling hands, his eyes quickly scanning the numbers and graphs. His face paled as he comprehended the magnitude of what he was seeing. This isn't possible," he murmured. "I would have noticed something like this. They've been hiding it very well," Mark explained. "But there's more. We believe your wife, Rachel, is involved in this, along with your friend, Jason Carter." Michael looked up sharply, his eyes full of disbelief and pain. No, that can't be true. Rachel would never. And Jason is my best friend." Elizabeth stepped forward, her heart breaking at seeing the pain in her son's eyes. "Michael, I know it's hard to believe, but you have to open your eyes. They've been manipulating you, using your trust against you." Michael staggered backward, as if his mother's words were a physical blow. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind struggling to process all this information. I need time to think," he finally said. "This is too much." Elizabeth nodded, understanding. "Of course, son, but please be careful. We don't know how far they're willing to go to keep their secret." Michael looked at his mother, and for a moment Elizabeth saw the boy he once was, scared and seeking comfort. But quickly the businessman's mask fell back into place. "Thank you for the information," he said, his voice formal and distant. "I'll investigate this personally." With that, Michael turned and began to run back the way he had come, leaving Elizabeth, Sarah, and Mark watching his retreating figure. "Do you think he believed us?" Sarah asked. Worried Elizabeth sighed, her heart heavy. "I don't know, but at least now he's been warned. I just hope it's not too late." What none of them knew was that, hidden among the nearby bushes, a man had been observing and recording the entire conversation. As soon as Michael disappeared from view, the man took out his phone and dialed a number. "Ma'am," he said in a low voice, "we have a problem. The old lady knows everything, and she just told Michael." On the other end of the line, at the Thompson mansion, Rachel gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Understood," she said, her voice cold as ice. "Initiate the contingency plan. It's time to end this once and for all." As she hung up the phone, Rachel looked out the window at the town spread out. Below her face, usually a mask of beauty and calm, was distorted by a mixture of rage and determination. "So you want to play, Elizabeth?" she murmured to herself. "Very well, let's play." And so, as the sun rose in the sky over Oakville, the gears of fate began to turn faster. The truth had come to light, but the consequences of that revelation were about to shake the foundations of the lives of all involved. The countdown to the climax of this story of betrayal and redemption had begun, and no one, not even those who thought they held all the cards, was prepared for what would come. Next, the sun rose over Oakville, its golden rays bathing the town in a light that seemed too bright, too cheerful for the drama that was about to unfold. At the Thompson mansion, Michael hadn't slept all night. The revelations of the previous day had left him in a state of confusion and anguish. he hadn't experienced since his father's death. Sitting in his study, surrounded by papers and documents, Michael struggled to reconcile what he knew. With what he had been told, how could it be possible that Rachel, the woman he had shared his life with for so many years, was involved in something like this? And Jason, his best friend since college, the man who had been by his side every step of his rise to success. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Rachel entered, looking impeccable as always in an elegant day dress. Her face showed concern, but there was something in her eyes, a spark of something Michael couldn't identify, that put him on alert. "Honey," Rachel said softly, approaching him, "you haven't slept all night. What's wrong?" Michael looked at her, searching her face for some indication of the betrayal his mother had warned him about. But all he saw was the woman he loved, the woman he had built a life with. "Rachel," he began, his voice tense, "I need to ask you a question, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Rachel sat down across from him, her face a mask of concern. "Of course, love. You know I'm always honest with you." Michael took a deep breath. "Are you involved in any kind of fraud in the company?" For a moment, a flash of something, surprise, fear, crossed Rachel's face, but it was so quick that Michael wasn't sure he had really seen it. "What? Michael, what are you talking about?" Rachel stood up, her voice trembling slightly. "How can you even ask something like that?" Michael ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. I know. It's just that some things have come up, some accusations." "Accusations?" Rachel interrupted him, her voice now firmer. "From whom? Don't tell me you've been talking to your mother." The way Rachel spat out the word mother made Michael flinch. "This isn't about my mother, Rachel. This is about millions of dollars disappearing from the company." Rachel approached him, taking his hands in hers. "Michael, look at me," she said softly. "I love you. We've built this life together. Do you really think I would do anything to jeopardize all that?" Michael wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to believe her. But the evidence his mother and Mark had shown him weighed on his mind. "I need to see the accounting books," he finally said. "All of them, and I need to talk to Jason." Something changed in Rachel's eyes at the mention of Jason, but she quickly regained her composure. "Of course, love whatever you need, but I think you should rest a bit first. You've been up all night." Michael nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted. "You're right, I'll take a nap and then I'll deal with this." Rachel smiled, leaning in to kiss him softly. "Rest, my love, I'll take care of everything." As Michael headed to the bedroom, Rachel took out her phone and sent a quick message. "It's falling apart. Accelerate the plan. Now or never." In another part of town, Elizabeth, Sarah, and Mark were gathered in Sarah's kitchen discussing their next move. "Do you think Michael believed us?" Sarah asked, pouring another cup of coffee. Elizabeth sighed, looking out the window. "I don't know, Michael has always been stubborn, but I saw doubt in his eyes. It's a start." Mark, who had been reviewing some papers, looked up. "We can't wait any longer. If Rachel and Jason suspect Michael knows something, they might try to cover their tracks." "What do you suggest?" Elizabeth asked. "We have to go to the police," Mark said. "With the evidence we have, they should be able to obtain a search warrant for the company and the mansion." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "You're right, we can't handle this alone." Just as they were about to leave, Elizabeth's phone rang. It was an unknown number. With her heart beating fast, she answered. "Hello?" "Elizabeth?" Michael's voice sounded tense, almost scared. "I need to see you now." Elizabeth looked at Sarah and Mark, her face pale. "Michael, what's going on?" "I can't explain it over the phone," Michael said quickly. "Meet me at the old warehouse near the dock. Come alone." Before Elizabeth could respond, Michael had hung up. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, worried about Elizabeth's expression. "It was Michael," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling slightly. "He wants to see me now." Mark frowned. "I don't like this. It could be a trap." Elizabeth shook her head. "He's my son. I have to go." "Then we'll go with you," Sarah said firmly. "No," Elizabeth said. Michael said to come alone. You go to the police, take the evidence, I'll meet with Michael. Mark seemed to want to protest, but something in Elizabeth's determination stopped him. Be careful. He finally said, if anything doesn't feel right, get out of there immediately. Elizabeth nodded, grabbing her purse. I will, and whatever happens, don't forget to go to the police. As Elizabeth headed towards the dock, the sky began to darken. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, as if nature itself sensed the drama that was about to unfold. The old warehouse loomed before her, a decrepit building that seemed out of place among the modern buildings of the port. Elizabeth paused in front of the door, her heart beating hard. For a moment, she hesitated. What if Mark was right? What if this was a trap? But a mother's love overcame any doubt. With a deep breath, Elizabeth opened the door and entered. The interior of the warehouse was dark and dusty. Beams of light filtered through dirty windows, creating strange shadows on the floor. Michael, Elizabeth called, her voice echoing in the empty space. Suddenly, there was a noise behind her. Before she could turn around, she felt a blow to her head and everything went black. When Elizabeth regained consciousness, she found herself tied to a chair. Her head hurt and her vision was blurry. Gradually, the figures in front of her began to take shape. Well, well, said a voice that Elizabeth recognized with horror. The old lady finally wakes up. Rachel was standing in front of her, her beautiful face distorted by a cruel smile. Beside her was Jason, his expression a mixture of nervousness and determination. Where's Michael? Elizabeth asked, her voice weak but defiant. Rachel laughed, a cold sound without joy. Oh, Elizabeth, always so naive. Michael isn't here, he never was. The reality of the situation hit Elizabeth like a punch. She had fallen right into a trap. What do you want from me? Elizabeth asked, struggling against the ropes that bound her. Jason stepped forward. We want you to disappear, Elizabeth, permanently. Rachel nodded, her smile turning even colder. You see, we were so close to completing our plan. Years of careful work, moving the money little by little, preparing for the final blow, and then you had to stick your nose where it didn't belong. You won't get away with this, Elizabeth said, her voice firmer now. Michael will find out. Michael? Rachel let out a laugh. Michael is too busy dealing with a crisis at the company. A crisis that we orchestrated, by the way. By the time he realizes what's really going on, we'll be long gone with all his money. Elizabeth felt her heart sink. How could she have been so foolish? She had fallen right into their trap, and now not only was she in danger, but Michael was too. And what do you plan to do with me? Elizabeth asked, trying to buy time. She knew Sarah and Mark would go to the police. She just had to hold on until help arrived. Jason pulled a small vial from his pocket. This, he said, shaking the vial, is an undetectable poison. It will cause a heart attack that will look completely natural. Poor Michael Thompson's mother, devastated by the fight with her son, succumbs to stress. It's perfect. Elizabeth felt fear invade her, but she refused to show it. You'll never get away with this, she repeated. Her voice trembling slightly, Rachel approached, leaning in to look Elizabeth in the eyes. Oh, but we already have, dear mother-in-law. We already have. Meanwhile, at the Thompson mansion, Michael was finally waking from his exhaustion-induced nap. He felt disoriented, as if he had slept for days. He looked at the clock and was startled to see that several hours had passed. He got up quickly, determined to get to the bottom of this whole matter. But when he left the room, he found the mansion strangely silent. Rachel, he called, but there was no answer. He went downstairs, a feeling of unease growing in his chest. It was then that he noticed something strange in the study. The safe was open and empty. Panic began to take over him. He ran to the phone, dialing Jason's number with trembling fingers. But the phone rang and rang with no answer. It was, at that moment, as Michael's world began to crumble around him, that the doorbell rang. With his heart pounding, Michael went to answer. There on the threshold were Sarah and Mark, accompanied by 2 police officers. Mr. Thompson, said one of the officers, we need to talk to you about some financial irregularities in your company And about your mother's disappearance. Michael felt the ground open beneath his feet. My mother? He whispered. What's happened to my mother? Sarah stepped forward, her face full of concern. Michael, Elizabeth went to meet you. Wasn't she with you? The realization hit Michael like lightning. Everything fit now. His mother's suspicions, the documents he had been reviewing, Rachel and Jason's disappearance. It had all been part of a plan in which he had been a blind pawn. Oh my God, Michael murmured, falling to his knees. What have I done? As the storm finally broke over Oakville, bathing the town in torrential rain, the drama that had been brewing for years reached its climax. In an old warehouse by the dock, a mother fought for her life in the Thompson mansion. A son faced the terrible truth of his blindness, and somewhere in between, two traitors ran towards what they believed would be their freedom. But fate, as always, had its own plans. And before the sun rose again over Oakville, the truth would come to light, the guilty would face justice, and a shattered family would have the chance to heal its wounds. The countdown to the final denouement had begun, and no one, not even those who thought they held all the cards, was prepared for what would come next. At the warehouse, Elizabeth struggled against her bonds, her mind working frantically to find a way out. Rachel and Jason were arguing in low voices in a corner, clearly nervous about something. We have to do it now, Jason insisted, shaking the vial of poison. Every minute that passes is a risk. Rachel seemed to hesitate. What if someone saw her come in here? We should move her to another location. Elizabeth saw her opportunity. It's too late, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. The police are already on their way. Rachel turned to her, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. You're lying. Are you sure? Elizabeth challenged. Do you want to take that risk? Doubt flickered in Rachel and Jason's eyes. That moment of hesitation was all Elizabeth needed. With supreme effort, she managed to topple the chair, falling to the ground with a crash. Chaos erupted. Jason ran towards Elizabeth, the vial of poison in his hand, but he tripped over the debris scattered across the warehouse floor. The vial flew from his hand, shattering against the ground and spilling its contents. Rachel screamed in frustration, running towards the door, but just as she was about to reach the door burst open. Michael stood there, his face a mask of fury and pain. Behind him, several police officers rushed in, their weapons drawn. Freeze, everyone, one of the officers shouted. Time seemed to stand still for a moment. Rachel, caught in the middle of her escape, looked at Michael with a mixture of surprise and contempt. Jason, still on the ground next to the broken vial, slowly raised his hands. Michael, Rachel whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Honey, this isn't what it looks like. But Michael wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on his mother, tied up and on the floor. In 2 strides, he was at her side, untying her bonds with shaking hands. Mom, he said, his voice breaking with emotion, I'm so sorry you were right about everything. Elizabeth, finally free, hugged her son tightly. Oh, Michael, she sobbed. I was so scared I thought I'd lost you forever. As mother and son reunited, the police officers moved to arrest Rachel and Jason. But Rachel, seeing her plan crumbling, made one last desperate attempt. Wait, she shouted, pulling a small object from her purse. I have a bomb. If you take one more step, I'll blow this place up. Everyone froze. The officers backed away, pointing their weapons at Rachel. Michael stood up, placing himself protectively in front of his mother. Rachel, Michael said, his voice calm despite the fear he felt. It's over. Don't make this worse than it already is. Rachel laughed, a hysterical, joyless sound. Worse? How could it be worse, Michael? We had it all planned out. We were going to be rich, free, and your stupid mother ruined everything. No, Michael said firmly. You ruined everything with your lies, your greed. I loved you, Rachel, I gave you everything I had. For a moment, something resembling remorse crossed Rachel's face, but it was quickly replaced by a mask of cold determination. If I can't have it all, she said, her finger moving towards the detonator. Then no one will... What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Rachel pressed the button, but instead of the explosion everyone feared, nothing happened. The supposed detonator was fake. Taking advantage of the moment of confusion, one of the officers lunged forward, tackling Rachel to the ground. Within seconds, both she and Jason were handcuffed and being led out of the warehouse. Michael collapsed to his knees, relief and exhaustion finally overtaking him. Elizabeth knelt beside him, hugging him tightly. "It's over," Elizabeth murmured, stroking her son's hair as she used to when he was little. "It's all over." Michael looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "Mum, I am so sorry for everything, for how I treated you, for not believing you." Elizabeth put a finger to her son's lips, gently silencing him. "Shh, it's past, we're together now, that's all that matters." As the police finished processing the scene and taking statements, Sarah and Mark were finally able to enter the warehouse. Seeing Elizabeth and Michael embracing on the floor, they rushed towards them. "Elizabeth!" Sarah exclaimed, tears of relief running down her cheeks. "Thank God you're all right." Mark, ever the professional, was already talking to the officers, ensuring that all evidence was properly collected. Gradually, the chaos began to dissipate. Paramedics arrived to check on Elizabeth and make sure she had no serious injuries. Michael, still in shock from everything that had happened, stayed close to his mother at all times, as if afraid she might disappear if he let her out of his sight. Hours later, as the sun began to peek over the horizon, Elizabeth, Michael, Sarah and Mark found themselves in Sarah's living room. Steaming cups of tea sat in front of them, but no one was drinking. The exhaustion and disbelief from the previous night's events still weighed heavily on them. "So," Sarah finally said, breaking the silence, "what happens now?" Michael sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Rachel and Jason will face charges for fraud, attempted murder, and who knows what else. The company, well, it will take time, but I think we can recover from the financial damage. And we," he added, looking at his mother with eyes full of regret and love, "have a lot to talk about and a lot to rebuild." Elizabeth took her son's hand, squeezing it gently. "We have time, Michael. All the time in the world." Mark, who had been reviewing some papers, looked up. The police found documents in Jason's office that implicate several other company executives in the fraud. It seems the conspiracy was bigger than we thought. Michael nodded, his expression determined. "I'll clean up the company from top to bottom if necessary. No more secrets, no more deception." "And I'll be there to help you," Elizabeth said firmly. "If you'll let me, of course." Michael looked at his mother, a genuine smile lighting up his face for the first time in what seemed like years. "I wouldn't have it any other way, Mom." Sarah, tears in her eyes, raised her teacup. "To new beginnings," she said. The others raised their cups, joining in the toast. "To new beginnings," they repeated in unison. As the sun rose in the sky, bathing Oakville in a golden light, the Thompson family, broken and rebuilt, looked to the future with hope. The path to reconciliation and redemption would be long and at times difficult. There would be moments of doubt, of pain, of bitter memories that would threaten to reopen old wounds. But at that moment, sitting together in Sarah's cozy living room, sharing the warmth of their teacups and the comfort of each other's company, Elizabeth and Michael knew they could overcome any obstacle. Because in the end, a mother's love for her son and a son's love for his mother had proven to be stronger than any betrayal, more powerful than any lie. And so, as Oakville awakened to a new day, the Thompson family began to write a new chapter in their story. A story of forgiveness, of second chances, and of the redemptive power of unconditional love.